Hello, this is an open letter to Allegheny General Hospital and the CDC. My name's Jason Hoover, and this week my dad passed away. For the last 11 days of his life, he was completely isolated in the hospital. His room turned into a veritable bubble. He was allowed no visitors, and he was handled like a patient in a medical disaster movie. The single reason for this isolation and treatment? A lone positive COVID-19 test. I'd like to tell you the story of his last 11 days. It's an egregious example of how outdated and nonsensical COVID policies continue to create so much unnecessary collateral damage. My 71-year-old dad was admitted to Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh a few weeks ago with severe complications from dialysis. He had been stricken with a rare disease called ANCA vasculitis just a few months ago, and his health had been on a roller coaster with many complications, including renal failure, for which he was receiving regular dialysis. Before his sudden illness, my dad was active, healthy, hardworking, and sharp as a tack. When he tested positive for COVID, things still looked promising. He had been in the hospital for a little over a week at that point, and we were told the good news that he was recovering and was, quote, really no longer an ICU patient, intensive care unit, according to his doctor. His trajectory was positive, and the only reason he was still in the ICU was due to hospital COVID policies. Now, my father was not experiencing any COVID symptoms, and he did not enter the hospital with COVID. In addition, at least one member of his physician team believed his COVID to be inactive, but that didn't matter. Due to current CDC guidance, for immunocompromised patients with COVID, the hospital required isolating the patients for a full 20 days. Isolation meant that any professional entering his now sealed room would be required to wear what most laymen would describe as hazmat gear. But much more relevantly, isolation also meant no visitors. His family would be unable to be with him, even though he was fully conscious, yet immobile. My mom, my wife, myself, and others were not even permitted in his room, so he can see us, hear us, touch us, and know we were there for him. In the 11 days that followed, my dad succumbed to a severe fungal infection, which was devastating considering his immunocompromised state. His condition deteriorated such that continuing life was improbable at best. He would likely require a ventilator and 24-hour dialysis, and we were forced to decide whether to turn off his life support, and we knew what my dad wanted. However, even as they removed the feeding tube and ventilator, knowing he'd pass in mere minutes, if not seconds, my mother, his wife of 46 years, was not even allowed to be with him without full suit, respirator, rubber gloves, face shield, and cloth mask, while my wife, aunt, and I all waited outside the bubble. And I can't begin to tell you how sad a sight it was to see my mother crying through her cloth mask under her face shield and respirator, her rubber gloves not even permitting her to directly touch his hand, and a respirator not allowing her to give him one last kiss goodbye. Here's the rub. Upon reading the CDC guidance, we discovered that these protocols were in place not for my father's protection, but rather to protect others from him, as he would supposedly be contagious with COVID for a longer period in his compromised state. The policies were clearly not intended for the sake of the patient. In addition, these policies simply didn't make sense, considering the current state of COVID and its impacts on public health. Rather, the policies clearly dated back to early variants of COVID, variants which were far more severe than today's dominant strains. Despite speaking with several doctors and administrative people for days, pleading with them, the hospital showed zero willingness to change their policy to accommodate our one single request, which was simply for my mother to be allowed to be with my dad properly, in his room, in person, face to face, without the hazmat gear. We viewed this as so very important to his healing, and she was devastated she couldn't be with him. But, to add insult, the hospital's policies were so rigid that they were unwilling to even retest him for COVID. Another positive test would result in a, quote, resetting of the clock and another 20 days of mandatory isolation, even if subsequent tests were negative. Note that based on test specificity and the disease prevalence, there was still a significant chance that my father never in fact had active COVID, but the accuracy of the diagnosis didn't seem to matter. In addition, my father was denied at least one previously planned and critical heart test because of the isolation policies and the hospital's concern for, quote, protection of the test staff. We're not sure what other tests or treatments were not given due to perceived risks to staff over his final 11 days. Now, Was my father's complete isolation from his family for 11 full days detrimental to his recovery? We think so. How might you feel when, as your health deteriorated, you couldn't even see your family, and anyone who came into your room was dressed as if you were toxic? Would you feel encouraged to fight and recover? Or would you feel alone, like you were a burden to others? In addition, my mother was robbed of the one single thing she could do to help with his recovery, which was merely to be with him and remind him how much he was loved. We placed my father at Allegheny General so he can have the best chance of recovery. However, residual COVID policies hurt my father, hurt my mother, and provided little to no impact to others' well-being. Considering today's COVID, when will the healthcare community wake up and take action? I couldn't believe how doctors and nurses, true heroes who served their patients so courageously and selflessly during the initial years of the pandemic, could now so passively stand by while witnessing this treatment and not speak up about the travesty of these policies. Literally every staff member we spoke with claimed they couldn't change the policies, that they were out of their control. And there seems to be zero accountability for anyone involved in continuing these outdated, asinine policies, which harmed us and undoubtedly will continue to harm others. These policies date back to early variants of COVID, which were far more severe than today's. And anybody with a willingness to actually look at data and consider the circumstances can clearly see their absurdity. And if you don't mind, I'd like to offer a few data points. Number one, U.S. deaths have continued to drop dramatically from upwards of 2,000 to 3,000 deaths per day at the peak of the pandemic to only around 500 today. The damage from COVID is now comparable to the ordinary flu. Today's COVID virus is simply not the same virus as the original or Delta variant, a statement with which any informed health expert must certainly agree. We know this as a society, clearly evidenced by how our behaviors have returned to normal over the past year. Why then are people still isolated for COVID? Will we now start to isolate patients from their families for other viruses, like the now branded, quote, triple threat of COVID, flu, and RSV, for which the CDC now recommends we begin to wear masks again? Certainly hope not. Number two, the vast majority of hospital staff have been vaccinated and boosted. Or does this simply not matter at all anymore? If my mom's vaccination apparently didn't matter, nor my father's doctors or nurses, nor my dad's own for that matter, why does Yulia Hicks's matter so much? This poor 14-year-old girl is currently being denied a kidney transplant by Duke University Hospital for the only reason that she hasn't taken a COVID vaccine. Now, since she's already had COVID, the incremental benefits of the vaccine beyond her natural immunity are minuscule at best, even for an immunocompromised patient. How are healers so unforgivably denying this poor 14-year-old girl a life-saving procedure based on what is so obviously a trivial matter today? Could we at least apply the vaccine logic consistently? See, in my dad's case, the vaccines were completely immaterial, but in Yulia's case, they're paramount. Contrasted with my father's treatment, this poor girl's treatment is hypocritical at best. Number three, the CDC currently estimates a prevalence of COVID of over 1 million new infections per day in the U.S. That means that if every dying patient's spouse, like my mom, were permitted to see the patient, like my dad, as they passed, these 500 deaths per day, and if every one of their visitors contracted COVID, the prevalence would increase by a minuscule 0.5% at most, i.e. 1 million could increase to 1,500,000 new infections, a mere drop in the bucket. Would these 500 additional people be any more infectious than the other million? No. And is there any more significant event that would permit person-to-person contact than their spouse's imminent death? Number four, perhaps most absurdly, there's an abundance of opportunities for COVID to enter the ICU. Dozens of visitors are allowed every day to visit patients in the ICU, many of whom are undoubtedly infected with COVID given current prevalence. Do ICU patients bear more risk from my father or his one visitor than the inevitable portion of these many other visitors carrying COVID? Or risk from the hospital staff themselves, who interact with many patients and with their family and friends at home, and who inevitably carry COVID and other viruses into the facility during the pre-symptomatic phase of the infection, whose mere masks are only 38.5% effective at blocking virus particles, according to the EPA. Note that these protections obviously did not help my father himself, who undoubtedly became infected with COVID in the hospital. The hospital's extreme draconian measures to isolate my father were akin to putting all their efforts into plugging the tiniest hole in a leaking dike while allowing other holes to pour in water like a fire hose. Or in this case, to pour in A, COVID, and B, other now more severe viruses into the hospital. These policies simply make zero sense. Doctors, nurses, even the hospital administrators aren't the villains in this story, and I'm not sure they would have been able to save my dad's life given his condition. I'm not angry at people. I believe this tragedy is the fault of systems and the way they work. And for an engineer like me, it's important to understand the problem so we can begin to solve it. So in my view, people are resistant to change. They seek to maintain the status quo, but they're mobilized in times of crisis. And through the COVID crisis, we accepted many changes for the public good, didn't we? However, now that the real crisis is over, we're left with its remnants, like outdated pandemic policies. These things are now part of the status quo, and they take a life of their own, supported by the bureaucracy. They're tough to change, and they're hard to get rid of. This is just how things work. However, their immense collateral damage will continue, continuing well past the end of the pandemic, unless we act. We're far from the only family that suffered from these policies. I deeply feel for the people who couldn't see their loved ones in nursing homes in the initial years of the pandemic, and for people who lost moms and dads, brothers and sisters, even children throughout. I feel for hospital staffs who dealt with a horrible virus for 2 years, fighting so admirably through so much suffering, uncertainty, and triage, working long hours while wearing uncomfortable respirators, and unable to help so many patients. And yes, we will likely have a winter resurgence, at least to some degree. However, the policies of yesterday must be revised, as the virus today is not the virus of yesterday. Institutions like the CDC, who effectively instantiated these policies throughout our hospital system, must act to change them, and hospitals must push back. It's far too easy for bureaucrats to push policies when they don't have to live through their effects on the front lines. And for many reasons, it's far too difficult to peel back policies once implemented. For this reason, doctors and nurses must push back against central bureaucrats and demand sensible policies in line with today's realities. Policies which will once again allow them to optimally heal patients and allow loved ones to be with one another during times of crisis, healing, and especially the last days of life. We were once wise enough to place these values over the opinions of bureaucrats, lawyers, and ideologues. We were once brave enough to stand up for what was right despite personal cost. And we were once responsible enough to know that our blood, toil, tears, and sweat can truly make a difference. Tragedy and sadness of James Hoover's death were made horribly worse by outdated and ineffective hospital policies for handling COVID. I can't tell you how much he'll be missed. My only hope is that Allegheny General and perhaps other hospitals see fit to debate this case and change these terrible policies, and that it might help others like Yulia avoid similar tragedies. We're better than this. Lastly, a heartfelt thank you to the doctors and nurses who cared for my dad. We are so grateful for your tireless work and empathy. Sincerely, Jason Hoover, December 9, 2022.